Behind the Iron River, symbolism of borders in Henry Bibb's slave narrative and a selection of slave songs. Is Canada the promised land? Is it because of the taxes being so low? And what about the Ohio River? Is it really made of iron? If you seek answers to all these questions, stay tuned. Throughout the history of humankind, borders have played a central role in storytelling. They appear both as physical and metaphorical boundaries between real or symbolic places, and they often represent a challenging threshold that has to be overcome. Two prominent examples can be found in the Bible. The first one in Exodus 14, where Moses leads the Israelites through the parting Red Sea, out of Egyptian bondage into the prospect of freedom. The other example can be read in the book of Joshua 3 and 4. There, the Israelites cross the Jordan River and finally enter the Promised Land. Other examples range from the river Styx in Greek mythology, over the Mississippi River in Huckleberry Finn, to the river Anduin in The Lord of the Rings. Things get even nerdier when we examine the tale of the three brothers, as told towards the end of the Harry Potter series. But this we might say for another day. For now, we concentrate on something that all these stories have in common, which is the element of water. Water, without which man cannot survive, but which can carry all the connotations of death and destruction, holds by nature great symbolic potential. Today, we set out to examine the role of water in a very specific genre and a very specific time period. The narrative of the life and adventures of Henry Bibb, an American slave, was published in 1849. Comprehensive and straightforward as book titles were phrased back in the day, it makes classification pretty easy. What we have in front of us is a slave narrative, in this case, the autobiography of Henry Bibb, who was born a slave in Kentucky and later fled to the Free States in the North and finally to Canada. The first African-American slave narratives already emerged in the 18th century. When referring to slave narratives written and published in the 1830s and 1840s, we can more precisely classify them as antebellum slave narratives. Conversely to their predecessors, antebellum slave narratives adhere to stricter literary conventions, which first and foremost cater to the political agenda of anti-slavery societies. This we should keep in mind when exploring the stylistic devices employed by Bibb. Slave narratives usually employ a first-person narrator. While the narrating eye reflects on the spiritual and physical journey to freedom, the experiencing eye conveys more immanent impressions of the cruel reality in slaveholding states. This dynamic interplay of reflection and direct impression can be explained by their condition of origin. Slave narratives were often rehearsed orally at abolitionist conventions before they were written down and published in books. Zooming into the second chapter of Bibb's autobiography, we can find a stunning as well as plain example of retrospective reflection, which also contains our first biblical allusion. It says, "But more especially after having been flogged, I have fled to the highest hills of the forest, pressing my way to the north for refuge. But the river Ohio was my limit. To me it was an impassable gulf. I had no rod wherewith to smite the stream, and thereby divide the waters. I had no Moses to go before me and lead the way from bondage to a promised land. Yet I was in a far worse state than Egyptian bondage, for they had houses and land, I had none. They had oxen and sheep, I had none. They had wise counsel to tell them what to do and where to go, and even to go with them, I had none. I was surrounded by opposition on every hand. My friends were few and far between. I have often felt when running away as if I had scarcely a friend on earth." Here the narrator employs a rather poetical, almost sermon-like style, contrasting with the otherwise straightforward tone of the text. Bibb as an author makes use of repetition, parallelism, and biblical references. What is stunning about this passage is that he does not simply perpetuate the Exodus metaphor. Instead, he readjusts it to his own situation, saying, "I had no Moses to go before me." He calls out the insufficiencies of the comparison, depicting his situation as even worse than that of the Israelites. But despite this deviation from a strict comparison, he sticks to the general metaphor and introduces the Ohio River as a central threshold. On the same page he continues, Sometimes, standing on the Ohio River bluff, looking over on a free state and as far north as my eyes could see, I have eagerly gazed upon the blue sky of the free north, which at times constrained me to cry out from the depth of my soul, "O Canada, sweet land of rest! Oh, when shall I get there? Oh, that I had the wings of a dove, that I might soar away to where there is no slavery, no clanking of chains, no captives, no lacerating of backs, no parting of husbands and wives, and where man ceases to be the property of his fellow man." These thoughts have revolved in my mind 1,000 times. I have stood upon the lofty banks of the Ohio River, gazing upon the splendid steamboats wafted with all their magnificence up and down the river, and I thought of the fishes of the water, the fowls of the air, and the wild beasts in the forest. All appear to be free to go just where they please, and I was an unhappy slave. While the narrator questioned the similarities between his situation and that of the Israelites earlier, these passages reinforce the biblical illusion of Canada as a promised land and the river crossing as a vital and necessary step to freedom. Once again, a parallelism can be observed in the structure of these two paragraphs, both starting with the narrator looking over the Ohio River. There are also prayer-like elements, which, combined with repetition, emphasize the narrator's longing to reach the lands beyond the river. A look at the map sheds light onto the circumstances under which Henry Bibb develops these strong associations between river and border, as well as between the other side and freedom. Shelby County, Bibb's birthplace, lies in the north of Kentucky and, with a distance of only 24 miles, quite close to the Ohio River. Not only does this river mark the border to Ohio, but as a natural extension to the Mason-Dixon line, a major threshold between the southern slave states and the free North. By the 4th chapter of the book, Bibb is already married and lives on the same plantation as his wife, Melinda, close to Bedford. From there, he eventually manages to cross the river, landing in Madison, Indiana, a free state. In stark contrast to the poetical and rhetorically loaded passages in the beginning, his description of crossing the river is surprisingly straightforward. "When I arrived at the river, I managed to find a conveyance to cross over into a free state." But what follows is no epiphany, no moment of relief. The blue skies of the free North are never mentioned again throughout the rest of the book. Instead, the ever-present fear of being recaptured, hunger and cold in a strange and potentially hostile environment set the tone. The escape continues, while redemption remains a thing that happens in stories, not in real life. This brings us back to the cultural, social, and political premises of slave narratives. What about intention and readership? Concerning the antebellum slave narrative, Gould states that the central abolitionist project of exposing the evils of the southern plantation and the false paternalistic myth supporting it became the absolute priority of the antebellum slave narrative. The genre now focused, often with painstaking vigilance, on the actual daily conditions of slave life, because abolitionist readers and publishers desired, indeed required, that kind of detailed evidence. Gould also identifies the contemporary conventions as constraints on black expression, noting that ex-slaves were asked to only state the basic facts of their lives. Bibb's style of narrative fits neatly into this description and the general features of antebellum slave narratives, stating the facts and providing objective, evidence-like information for a wide abolitionist readership. This seems to apply not only for the conditions in the slave states, but also for the description of the dangers that haunted slaves who made it to the northern states. A different role of water can be explored in slave songs. Conversely to the slave narrative, slave songs are not addressed at white abolitionists. They were sung by slaves. Why and when and for whom is best explained by Frederick Douglass himself. While on their way, they, the slaves, would make the dense old woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy and the deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. The thought that came up came out, if not the word, in the sound. He continues, "They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. The key word here is emotion, not the basic facts, no rhetorically sharpened arguments to impress abolitionist circles, but singing as a valve for pent-up sorrow and pent-up pain. In a time when philosophical considerations and arguments were a prominent part of the anti-slavery movement, Douglas reflects on the potential of the emotion carried by slave songs. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. So let's have a look at a song that is mentioned in Sarah H. Bartford's autobiography of Harriet Tubman. When there a old chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. I'm bound for the promised land, I'm going to leave you. I'll meet you in the morning, I'm bound for the promised land, on the other side of Jordan, bound for the promised land. The motive of the chariot, the promised land, and the river Jordan are also present in another, more formalized song called Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home. I looked over Jordan and what did I see? Coming forward to carry me home, a band of angels coming after me, coming forward to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming forward to carry me home, tell all my friends that I'm coming too, coming forward to carry me home. This song consists of 3 verses and the chorus beginning with Swing low, sweet chariot. Each verse consists of 4 lines with a cross rhyme that is mostly realized with an epiphora. The same applies to the chorus. The meter is irregular. The chariot refers to the prophet Elias' ascent to heaven in the Old Testament. In other words, it is a symbol for leaving this world and its troubles behind and entering heaven. This adds a layer of ambiguity to the metaphor we established earlier, which was about Canada as a promised land. In this song, death is another potential way to salvation. In both songs, it is hope that is emphasized. The biblical references are not questioned, but reinforced, and belief in them is confirmed. The role of water is even more apparent in the slave song Wade in the Water. Here, the process of crossing borders, the journey itself is highlighted. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. Who are those children all dressed in red? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. The expression wade in the water highlights the spiritual connection to water and also the journey itself as a slow and weary undertaking. The hope for protection is again expressed with a biblical reference to Exodus. God's gonna trouble the water, meaning that God will protect you from your persecutors. Apart from the spiritual meaning, this also has a practical aspect. Walking through water helped to shake off the bloodhounds following at the heels of escaping slaves. The analyzed passages of Henry Bibb's autobiography and the slave songs show that there is a clear difference in how biblical metaphors are utilized and interpreted. While the songs express hope, reiterate and reinforce belief in the biblical stories, the slave narrative provides a more comprehensive and sober picture of reality. Crossing into the northern states was not a magic step into freedom. The Ohio River was not a divine threshold to a promised land. Even in Canada, where the Fugitive Slave Act did not apply, sorrows didn't end. As Bibb reflects, I confess it to be one of the most self-denying acts of my whole life, to take leave of an affectionate wife who stood before me on my departure, with dear little Frances in her arms and with tears of sorrow in her eyes as she bid me a long farewell. In the end, Bibb fails to bring his family with him to Canada. His many dangerous attempts to rescue them prove a point, which is that leaving loved ones behind can throw a dark shadow on a land flowing with milk and honey. While slave songs pick up biblical stories and water as a spiritual element, fostering hope and belief, the slave narrative gives a sober contemplation of what it means in reality to cross a border and escape. And this, dear listener, brings us back to our title, behind the Iron River, which is, of course, an allusion to the Iron Curtain. Similar to the North-South divide, the Cold War brought with it a sharp separation of East and West. Just like the southern slave-holding states represented a set of values opposite to the northern states, Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and Western Europe followed seemingly incompatible agendas. Even if a comparison between the Cold War and the Civil War lacks consistency in many parts of its complexities, there is still something that both have in common. Refugees had to cross a border, or even multiple borders, may it be man-made walls and fences, or natural ones such as rivers. And although dreams of the other side might have been a source for hope throughout the journey, it might well be the case that real escapes never reached the ideal of salvation and redemption, as told in our oldest stories.